Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Laik Siddiqui, the father of Holophase. We are not done with weaving a coherent overview of episode 14. Let us continue where we left off in previous parts and capture the true scale of what we are trying to achieve in this episode. Let me say the claim plainly, in a way that makes your stomach tighten a little, because it should. Episode 14 is not a theory of our universe. Episode 14 is the minimum blueprint for any universe that can ever become publicly readable. Any universe that can ever be known, shared, measured, disagreed about, agreed about, or reconstructed by finite beings using finite instruments. Not our physics, not our particles, not our spacetime, not our cosmology, just this. The conditions under which a reality can be extracted from comparison. And if you understand that sentence, you understand why the scale of episode 14 is bigger than almost anything people usually mean when they say a theory of everything. Because it doesn't compete with theories of everything. It sits underneath them like a compiler sits underneath every program that can run. Now I'm going to show you why. And I'm going to do it with the same discipline we've sworn to. Episode 14 is timeless. It contains no story of unfolding. It contains no laws of motion. It contains no entropy, no probability, no the universe begins, no then it becomes. This is only structure extraction, only legibility, only the grammar that any possible world must obey if it is going to be a world we can speak about publicly. The first truth: a universe that cannot be compared is not a public universe. Imagine a universe that has no comparability at all. Not it's hard to measure. Not we lack technology. I mean something deeper. Nothing can be compared to anything else. No notion of same, different, before, after, near, far, more, less, repeat, change. No contrast, no distinction. Such a universe might exist in some poetic sense, but it cannot be a public universe. It cannot become science. It cannot become shared knowledge. Not because you or I are ignorant, because there is no meaningful place for a claim to latch onto. Public knowledge is not magic. Public knowledge is a discipline. Different observers, different instruments, different times can check the same claim. That checking requires one thing before all others: comparison. That is why phi is not a choice. It is not a style. It is not a flavor of metaphysics. It is the smallest permission for any readable reality to exist at all. Episode 14 starts here and refuses to move until this is burned into the foundation. If something cannot be compared, it cannot be a public fact. This is why episode 14 is universal. Because the moment you say any universe, you are already implying a universe that could be described. And description is comparison. So the bigness of episode 14 begins with this. It is not describing what exists. It is describing what must be true for existence to become legible. The second truth: comparisons must be finite, local, and licensed. Now imagine a universe that has comparisons, but where comparisons can only be made by infinite beings with infinite reach and infinite precision. That universe may be real, but to us, and to any finite knower, it is not a public universe. Because public knowledge is built by finite beings with finite instruments inside finite access. This is why the window mandate is not a technical detail. It is the definition of what public reality is. Episode 14 says, any claim that pretends to be public must come with something like a passport. It must declare what you measured, where you measured it, what boundary defines inside and outside, what resolution you had, what you masked out as invalid, what uncertainty you admit, what ceiling you cannot cross. This is not bureaucracy. This is the price of speaking without lying. And here's the key. This is universal too. Because any observer, human, alien, machine, or something we cannot imagine, will have finite access. Even if their window is vast compared to ours, it is still a window. Even if their instruments are more refined, there is still a maximum detail their public claims can certify without cheating. So, episode 14 is saying something enormous, very calmly. A universe with no windows is a universe with no public truth. That sentence alone is a philosophical earthquake, because it means truth is not floating in the air as a global object. Truth, in the public sense, is a certified extraction within declared boundaries. This is not relativism, it is discipline, and it applies to any possible universe in which public knowledge is possible. The third truth: if you want derivatives, you must earn them. Now we enter the engine room. If phi is a cyclic comparability field, something that lives on a circle, then you cannot just differentiate it globally like it's a nice real valued function. A circle is not a line. It wraps, it has winding, it has obstructions. So, episode 14 introduces the first serious idea that makes this blueprint universal, not parochial: local lifting. You unwrap the circle locally, not as a claim about reality, but as a claim about what a derivative means. If you want to speak about rate of change in any universe built on cyclic comparability, you must first build a local representation where change is defined. This is like reading a globe. If you want to measure distances and directions, you must choose a local map projection. But you must never mistake the projection for the Earth. Different projections exist. None is the true one. Yet distances can be computed if you do it honestly and keep track of equivalence. Episode 14 does the same thing for phi. It says, you may choose a local lift, but then you must respect the equivalence class of lifts. If your claim depends on which lift you chose, if it changes when you add a constant or shift by full turns, then your claim was not public structure. It was representation noise. And here comes another universal statement. Any publicly meaningful structure must be invariant under changes of representation. That's not specific to our universe. There is a rule of public knowledge itself. If a measurement changes when you rename coordinates, it is not a property of the world. It is a property of your naming. Episode 14 builds this into the fabric. Meaning lives in equivalence classes, not in representatives. This is why the blueprint is for any universe. It is not describing specific laws. It is describing the minimal sanity conditions for legible structure. The fourth truth: you must cut what you cannot unwrap. Sometimes, a circle cannot be unwrapped consistently across the whole window. Not because of time, not because of dynamics, because of topology. So episode 14 forces a discipline that most people only learn after they've been burned by subtle mistakes. Branch cuts are not optional. A branch cut is bookkeeping. It is the price of a global story when the structure refuses to be globally single-valued. And the reason this matters for universality is that topology is not an extra. It is one of the fundamental ways structure can exist in any possible universe. Even in universes with different physics, different dimensions, different constants, different everything, topology still exists as the logic of gluing. Episode 14 therefore says, if a global unwrapping fails, you don't pretend. You declare cuts, you log the color, you track the integers, you enforce cut movability invariance. Why? Because if your result depends on where you drew the cut, you are not describing the universe, you are describing your pencil. This is universal. Any civilization that ever tries to build the public science of cyclic comparability will eventually rediscover the same rule. You must separate what is structural from what is representational. Episode 14 is the formalization of that separation. The fifth truth. You must define the domain where your claims are allowed to live. This part sounds technical until you realize it is a moral rule. Episode 14 says, you don't get to compute derivatives everywhere just because you want to. You define the certified domain D. What remains after you excise boundary colors, cut colors, defect neighborhoods, aliasing zones, anything where your operators are unlicensed or your reconstructions are counterfeit. In everyday language, it is this. You don't claim clarity where your method is blind. In a real laboratory, this is the difference between truth and self-deception. In a theory of universality, it becomes even more profound. Any universe that can be publicly known must allow the separation between where a statement is defined and where it is not, and must allow explicit recognition that undefined is not mysterious. It is typed. Episode 14 forces this humility into the blueprint itself. That's why it scales beyond our universe. It is not describing what exists. It is describing how public description avoids cheating. The sixth truth. The first forced object is not a particle, not a field, not a law. Now we reach one of the cleanest moments in the entire program. After you have windows, passports, coherence, identifiability, uncertainty, lifts, cuts, excisions, only then does episode 14 allow a first public carrier of change. A equals d fin on the certified domain. This A field is not a physics field living in spacetime. It is the minimal object that must exist if differences are to become differentiable structure. This is the universal backbone. Because any universe that permits local differentiation of cyclic comparability will have an object like this, some minimal derivative carrier, not necessarily called A, not necessarily interpreted the same way. But structurally, it is unavoidable. This is why episode 14 is a blueprint for any universe. It specifies the forced objects of legibility, not the contingent objects of our physics. Then it does something even more severe. It says even the familiar triad, time, space, motion, are not allowed as primitives. In episode 14, you only have readouts. Shadows of A under different projections. Again, universal. Because time and space are not required for legibility. What is required is structured comparability. If something like time and space exist in a particular universe, they must be compiled as stable readouts of deeper structure, not assumed as furniture. Episode 14 refuses furniture. That refusal is not stubbornness. It is the reason it can encode any universe. It does not assume the architecture of ours. The seventh truth. A finite being can only speak a finite sentence, even if reality is infinitely deep. Now comes the part listeners usually feel in their bones if you say it the right way. Reality might be endless, the depth might be bottomless, but a finite window with finite coherence and finite information cannot certify infinite derivative order. So episode 14 imposes a ceiling, Nmax W. This is not an engineering limit, it is a foundational rule. Beyond your ceiling, statements are not false, they are undefined. This is one of the deepest universality results in the whole map because it says, in any universe, infinite precision public science is impossible for finite observers, and therefore, all public theories are finite approximations. All public models saturate. All ultimate descriptions must be windowed and licensed. If you ever meet an alien civilization with public science, they will have an equivalent concept, even if they call it something else. A limit on what their windows can certify. Episode 14 doesn't guess their physics. It predicts their epistemic architecture. That is the scale of the claim. The eighth truth. Consistency checks are the lie detectors of structure. Once you have A and jets, episode 14 introduces grammar checks that are almost like the universe speaking back to you, saying, "You are allowed here," or "You are making a mistake." Integrability. DD foo equals a zero in smooth certified domains. Stokes consistency. Boundary must match interior modulo the certified integers. Path consistency. Transport tokens agree when domains are correctly typed. What is universal about this? In any possible universe, if you claim local derivatives, they must be internally consistent. If they are not consistent, there are only a few possibilities. You crossed an obstruction. You mishandled a cut. You violated the passport. You have aliasing leakage. Or the primitive is falsified. Episode 14 makes this classification mandatory. This is not physics. It is the logic of extracting structure from cyclic comparability, and it applies to any universe in which that extraction is even meaningful. The ninth truth. Global reality is stitched from local truth. No finite window is the whole universe. Even if a civilization has enormous reach, they build knowledge patch by patch, with overlaps, translations, and closure rules. Episode 14 formalizes that as Atlas compilation, and it says, the real global object is not one giant chart. It is a stitched fabric of patches whose overlaps agree up to certified integers and constants. Now listen. This is the most beautiful way to see why episode 14 is a blueprint of any universe, because it says a public universe is not given as a global God's eye field. It is built as a consistent atlas of local reconstructions. Any possible universe that is publicly knowable will be knowable in exactly this way, by patching. And if patching fails in a way that cannot be diagnosed by defects or bookkeeping error, then it is not one coherent public universe. It is either inconsistent measurement or inconsistent structure. Episode 14 treats coherence as a property that must be earned globally, not assumed. That is universal epistemology embedded as geometry-free structure. The 10th truth. Integers are the first indelible marks of existence. This is one of my most powerful ideas, and it lands hard when it's said right. In episode 14, the first truly permanent tokens are not masses or charges or particles. They are integers, winding numbers, holonomy, quantized charges. Why do integers show up? Not because the universe likes numbers. Because when you have a circle and you stitch local unwrappings and you circle an obstruction, there is only one thing that survives every allowed redescription: an integer count of how many turns you cannot erase. That is universal. Any possible universe grounded in cyclic comparability will generate indelible integers as soon as it has non-trivial topology. That means quantization is not an optional feature of our physics. It is a deep structural outcome of comparability plus obstruction. Episode 14 therefore predicts a kind of universality deeper than specific laws. If a universe contains cyclic comparability and admits obstructions, it will contain quantized topological tokens. This is why my framework can speak to any universe. It is not speaking about electrons. It is speaking about what must exist for an electron-like stable token to be possible. The 11th truth. Entities are not substances. They are stable certificates. Episode 14 does not allow me to say, this thing exists, as a substance claim. It forces a different idea. An entity is a stable invariant signature, something that persists under admissible perturbations within uncertainty budgets and equivalence rules. This is universal because it reframes thingness as a certification concept. In any publicly knowable universe, things are whatever patterns survive replication and translation and perturbation. Different universes may have different stable signatures, different defect types, different invariant bases. But the concept of entity as stable invariant signature is general. It doesn't assume our ontology. It defines what ontology must look like if it is to be public and reliable. The 12th truth. Scale is not history. Scale is access. Episode 14 has scale stratification, but it is not a story of the universe evolving. It is not cosmogenesis. It is not first this, then that. It is simply the recognition that different windows, ceilings, masks, and invariants produce different stable descriptions. Scale is an access layer, not a timeline. That is universal too. Any finite observer in any universe will discover that different measurement windows yield different stable effective descriptions. They will call it micro and macro, fine and coarse, quantum and classical, or something else, but the structure is the same. Episode 14 encodes that structure without choosing a story. Now, the real punchline, what episode 14 is actually claiming. Here is the simplest way to state why episode 14 can be the blueprint of any universe. A universe, in the scientific sense, is not everything that exists. A universe, in the public sense, is a domain of events, within which comparisons can be made, within finite windows, such that local structure can be extracted, stitched consistently across overlaps, producing invariants and stable tokens, with explicit limits and falsification paths. Episode 14 is exactly that pipeline. It does not tell you what the invariants are in any specific universe. It tells you what form invariants must take to be public. It does not tell you which defects exist. It tells you how any defect must behave to be real. It does not tell you which geometry emerges. It tells you what rules geometry must obey if it is derived, not smuggled. So the any universe claim is not a poetic boast. It is a logical result. Any universe that can be publicly known must compile into a language of windows, lifts, finite derivatives, overlap equivalences, topological tokens, invariants, and stability certificates. If it cannot, then it cannot be public knowledge. It becomes private mysticism, or incoherent noise, or non-scientific narrative. Episode 14 is the skeleton of public reality itself. The falsification spine. How could this universality fail? A claim this large must have a clean way to die. Episode 14 has that, the escape test. If someone produces a reproducible, licensed, windowed public structure that survives all equivalence collapses, survives all aliasing and cut audits, survives all uncertainty accounting, and still cannot be represented as a function of finite jets plus topology plus invariance under the episode 13b language, then one of two things is true. One, phi monism is false, or two, the language must be extended, with proof, not with storytelling. This is what makes the universality claim scientific. It is not everything fits because I say so. It is everything fits or it breaks us. Here is the exact breaking condition. Why this matters emotionally, not just technically. Now I want to speak to your heart without losing the firewall. Most people live inside the furniture of reality. They assume time, space, matter, energy. They inherit them like childhood language. They never ask what makes them readable. Episode 14 is the act of stepping behind the furniture and asking, What must be true for any of this to be speakable at all? And that is why it feels like a blueprint for all possible universes. Because it doesn't worship the furniture. It describes the grammar that any furniture must obey to be public. If you ever meet another universe, through theory, through simulation, through imagination, through some future science, episode 14 is telling you what you must do before you can claim you understand it. You must window it, license it, lift it, cut it honestly, extract finite jets, audit consistency, stitch an atlas, classify defects, build invariants, certify stability, admit ceilings. If you do that, you can build public knowledge in any universe that admits it. If you refuse to do that, you can tell stories forever and never know whether you're describing reality or your own hunger for meaning. That is the true scale of this episode. The one sentence the listener should carry out of part 2. Here it is. Episode 14 is not the blueprint of our universe's content. It is the blueprint of any universe's legibility. Not what exists. What must be true for existence to become publicly readable. Always. Peace be upon you.